Afghanistan has always been a topic of intense international attention, but why does it seem to be in a perpetual state of chaos? From the Soviet invasion to the US-led occupation, Afghanistan has experienced a series of conflicts that have left the country deeply scarred. Despite billions of dollars in aid and countless efforts to establish a functioning government, the recent collapse of its government and takeover by the gun-armed Taliban has once again raised questions about why Afghanistan has struggled to achieve stability. Join us in this video as we find out the reason behind it. Nestled among the majestic Hindu Kush and the Pamir Mountains, Afghanistan is a beautiful country with a rugged landscape. However, its landscape is the reason Afghanistan is a pretty isolated country. Despite its potential, it is also seriously lacking in development with limited infrastructure, and to make things worse, it does not even have any railways, so all the transportation is done by roads. And get this, Afghanistan is actually the lowest trading nation on Earth, ranking 173rd among exporters. The GDP rates are insanely low, around $2,900. It is the reason people there have some of the lowest per capita incomes and highest poverty rates in the world. Now, sure, the geography and isolation might have something to do with it, but come on. Other neighboring countries like India and Iran with similar landscapes seem to be doing just fine. So what is the deal with Afghanistan? Why is it still struggling politically and economically? Stick around to find out. We are going to reveal the actual reasons behind it. After gaining independence from Britain in 1919, Afghanistan was left to fend for itself. The British did not have much interest in the country, as it was mostly tribes of farmers and was a landlocked nation. In fact, the only significant change that the British brought to Afghanistan was to alter its shape on the map. Then came the first king of Afghanistan, Mohammad Zahir Shah, in 1933. He had big dreams of modernizing the country, but it was not an easy task. He tried a detribalizing policy to unify the tribes, but it only led to revolts. People did not want to give up power. They just wanted to live their own way. Despite the challenges, King Zahir Shah managed to establish a parliament, a central bank, a hydropower plant, and even a national university. However, these resources were used by a small portion of the population in Kabul and Herat, who were already from literate families, so no progress was being made. While the king did his best to improve the country's infrastructure, there were still many issues. Afghanistan was in huge financial trouble, and the government had a hard time getting people to pay taxes. This made it even harder to fund development projects and modernization efforts. So while the king may have had good intentions, it seemed like Afghanistan was still struggling to make significant progress. But what would happen next? Let's talk about Afghanistan during the Cold War. The little modernization that was going on in the country was completely stopped during this period. Both the US and the Soviets were competing to aid Afghanistan, but the Soviet aid was much more significant. The Communist Union teeming with power forced Afghanistan to start modernizing, but there were still issues to overcome. First of all, the country was pretty isolated, and there was a lack of technical skills which made it difficult for them to modernize. Plus, the government was pretty weak and received 80% of its budget in aid. That's a lot. Also, the plan for modernization was hindered by the state-run monopoly, which did not exactly help the situation. Then there was the issue of land reform. The government implemented some reforms which meant distributing land among farmers. But guess what? There was a huge confusion about who owned which land, and there was a lack of paperwork to sort it out. On top of that, they started moving resources from land to cities. This made a lot of people angry, especially students who showed resistance and came out in the streets to protest. Finally, the king was thrown out of power, and Daoud Khan took over in 1973. Chapter 4: Republic of Afghanistan. Now let's talk about the Republic of Afghanistan, which is there to save Afghanistan, but only for a short period of time. It all started when Daoud Khan took over as president. He had big plans to modernize the country and kick the US to the curb. And surprisingly, he did. He started nationalizing banks and other big firms, which understandably caused the US to pull out of its aid. But while Daoud was busy making bold moves, the Soviet Union was creeping in and increasing its power in Afghanistan. That made the Afghan government weaker than a house of cards in a hurricane. And to make matters worse, the country was super decentralized with all the power in Kabul. So it was no surprise that the Afghan people got fed up with Daoud and his regime. In 1978, they staged a coup, followed closely by another one by the Soviet Union. the Soviets turned Afghanistan into a Soviet public state. So the country was thrown back in time, once again. The Soviet Union failed to centralize the country, even though they tried urbanization plans, but that only served to divide the country even further. And if all that was not enough, more land reforms were imposed by the Soviet leaders, leading to the collapse of local communities. As you can imagine, this caused some pretty intense armed rebellions within the country. Many local groups were raised to power. These groups were supported, or should we say armed, by the US, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. So all in all, the Republic of Afghanistan was a hot mess and marked the beginning of a long and tumultuous chapter in the country's history. The next major thing that happened in the country of Afghanistan was the invasion by the Soviet Union. So, the Soviet Union did not invade Afghanistan to get control of the radical or violent fighters, as many people believed. Instead, they wanted to gain control over strategic locations that could potentially give them access to the Indian Ocean, expanding their trade routes. But the invasion turned out to be a disaster for Afghanistan, resulting in the deaths of over 2 million people and leaving more than 400,000 Afghans displaced. The Mujahideen, or anti-Soviet fighters, rose up all over the country to resist the Soviet Union. And then something unexpected happened. The US became friends with the Mujahideen, which is pretty wild when you think about it. In fact, a young Saudi billionaire's son even came to Afghanistan to help out. This was none other than Osama bin Laden. So the anti-Soviets started organizing both inside and outside the country. By 1985, the Mujahideen were a pretty powerful group and were attacking the Soviet troops with their full force. Although the Soviet Union went all in, they failed to take control, so they had to retreat from Afghanistan until 1989. Unfortunately, the invasion caused extensive damage and left the country in ruins, with both the economy and the people struggling to survive. So, after the Soviet Union left Afghanistan, things didn't really get better. In fact, things went from bad to worse. The country was left in a state of chaos and political instability, with no clear leadership or direction. Those who were in charge of the military thought they could also rule the country and took control, forming the Islamic State of Afghanistan. But instead of working towards the betterment of the country, they started collecting taxes in the form of loot, seizing lands and taking money, turning the country into a land of warlords. Meanwhile, across the border in Pakistan, a group known as the Taliban was forming. They were funded by the Saudis, so they took over Afghanistan in 1996 and changed the country's name to the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. However, their rule was nothing short of oppressive. They banned female education, enforced gender-based segregation, and prohibited women from working. These policies ultimately led to the collapse of the formal economy. The United States attempted to oust the Taliban by bombing certain regions, but their efforts only fueled the feud. The Taliban responded by bombing the US Embassy in Nairobi and the US Embassy in Tanzania. Tensions continued to rise until the Taliban carried out the devastating 9/11 attacks, leading to a massive US-led retaliation against terrorists, with a particular focus on Osama bin Laden. The US Army finally entered Afghanistan through Pakistan to take on the Taliban. There were a lot of soldiers from NATO countries and the US involved in the fight, so the Taliban got pushed out of power. They had to run away to different parts of the world, like the Middle East, Africa, and even China and Russia. It went on like this for over 20 years, and the country was completely messed up. Despite all the destruction, the efforts by NATO in Afghanistan led to some growth and improvements. Things like healthcare and infrastructure got better, and the country's economy got bigger. And eventually in 2011, after many efforts, the US managed to find Osama bin Laden. Now that they had found the main culprit, the US Army left Afghanistan in 2014, but they came back in 2017 to deal with the Taliban again. Finally, in 2020, they packed up and left for good. It was a long and controversial war, but it was finally over. The Taliban eventually emerged victorious in 2021 and gained control of Afghanistan once again. The situation is bleak. There are no women's rights, no education for women, and terrorism is on the rise. The prices of basic commodities such as food have gone up, and the drug trade has increased. It seemed like the country is back to relying on agriculture for some people to survive. On the not-so-bright side, the population is increasing, which means that the economic situation is only going to worsen. It is crazy to think that all the economic progress made in the last 2 decades went down the drain in a matter of months. But why are the Taliban still in power? Well, Afghanistan has always been a country built on isolation, and the government had no taxes, resources, or services to push back the Taliban. Due to the lack of centralization, there has been a power struggle for decades, and things seem to be getting worse with each passing day. The future of Afghanistan remains uncertain, but it is clear that the Taliban's control has already had devastating consequences for the people and the country.